Hello, Top Tuggers. Today, I'm releasing finally from the archive. Yes, the rumors are true. The episode with ARX-HAN, the master of New Wave Fiction himself, the proprietor and pseudo coiner of New Wave Fiction himself. He is a fantastic author. I had a great time talking with him. It was a fantastic time. This was actually my second ever grab bag in terms of recording, but obviously, this is my third one I'm releasing due to scheduling issues. And the this is I was still a nubile young man when I recorded this. There's still a lot in life I didn't yet to learn, like how to balance audio properly or how to do connections properly, and so forth and so forth. So the audio is a bit sketched, just a bit sketched, and the connection issues a little bit, but the connection issues go away about the 15 to 20 minute mark. And part two of this interview, which I'll be releasing about 2 to 4 days after this episode, has flawless connection and flawless audio for the most part. It's only part one that has the bad audio. And I expect my top tuggers, my toughest tuggers, who are obviously well versed in Strauss, knows very well that they must earn their knowledge. They must earn it, despite all this quote unquote bad audio. Every time someone with a voice modulator does a podcast, it's like, oh, the audio sucks, and I can barely hear them. Maybe if you pause your video game, actually sit down and actually pay attention to the pod, maybe you can actually hear what the guy is saying. Just for food for thought. I know I expect a high quality of academic diligence from my audience, as I made clear in the past. Our top tuggers, my toughest tuggers, will have no problem deciphering every single syllable heard in this podcast. I believe in you, Anna. And of course, if you want a taste of Han without having to do the work, you can obviously watch his excellent recently released interview with my fellow Spangma male himself, Jack BC from the Book Club from Hell. It was an excellent interview. Not as good as this one, but excellent nevertheless. I love my Spangma male. Spangma male's got to stick together. My fellow Faustian, I love you, man. Excellent interview. But yeah, so without further ado, let us talk to one of the founding fathers of this age of new wave fiction. Everyone, welcome to Gabe's Grab Bag with my second co-host of all time, ARX-HAN. Hello, Han. How you doing?
I'm doing great, brother. How are you doing?
Fantastic. And so with the grab bag, this is my second shot at this. The first time around, I did it with Hoffmeister. It was a blessing. He was very chill, and but it was too stiff. Everyone in the comments was like, it's supposed to be a grab bag. It's supposed to be a variety. It's a little too boring. So today, I'm finally spicing things up with one of the spiciest authors I know, the most forward-thinking authors I know, and that is with ARX Han. Now, the idea I wanted to do with today's interview, other than talking shop, basically, was that I kind of wanted to discuss your kind of banquet of writing. We'll start with your Substack pieces as little appetizers until we get to the main course. That is, of course, your masterpiece Incel. If you're down with that.
Very much so, and thank you for that kindly worded introduction.
Yeah. So, I noticed with your Substack pieces, you're very aware systemically of kind of the scene, not only the scene as in like a kind of holistic, but as a critical. You make PowerPoint, not PowerPoint, but you make diagrams of like the filters, the constant filtrations that an independent author has to go through. And one of my favorite of these. Oh, hold on. And then yeah, so the constant filtration of things. And one of my most interesting pieces, I think, on this was kind of the idea of the identity shredder. You kind of as a co-piece or as a duet with what's his name, Chris Lee, I believe his name is, the guy who wrote Asian American Psycho.
Yeah, Chris Lee wrote a fantastic piece that you referenced of literary criticism. I think not not just about Asian American art in general, but also Asian American literary art in particular. And the piece that I wrote was riffing off of that work that he did, and if you have any interest in the subject, you absolutely have to read the piece, particularly to get full context. But the part that really stuck out to me in particular was the sort of absence of anger in Asian American male which has almost universally been a characteristic of cultural production domestically in the US, with the possible sole exception of Beef on Netflix a couple of years back.
Anyway, no, what I was saying, what I found extremely interesting about that piece, which both the Asian American Psycho piece about the lack of anger and your piece about the Identity Shredder is basically is that the idea what we stylistically I really appreciated the fact that you compare and contrasted before you even got to the Asian American part was with the that of Arabs or Muslims. What has the Muslim world been like being introduced to the identity shredder of neoliberalism of the what we call the GAE, global American empire. And you see how this comparison contrast constricts how you see something that is overtly masculine that's alien to modernity, that alien to the Western logos like Islam, and how you see that it's basically been contained. It's been successfully contained, basically. Like you see it with this the Marvels, right? The Marvel entertainment products, and it's like the idea of identity is so central to human life, to human beings. That's part of the incel thing is that basically they lack an identity, or they're sole identity cluster they have is their sexual identity. That's been the only thing that liberalism hasn't completely or unable to strip apart. And with Identity Shredder, you see this idea of like, here's your safe identity as a Muslim character. You get your Netflix representation, and you have this trigger button. Some if you don't want to play in the modernity's rules, or you don't want to play by liberalism rules as a Muslim or as or a person of Arab descent, you have the trad button. You could always you have a memeplex to contact. You have the memeplex of thousand years of Islam. You have some edgy characters in politics you can attach yourself to. Um, but what I've noticed is with Asian, like you said, with Asian Americans, and also what Chris said in his piece with the Asian American Psycho, one of the most profound things I read from his piece was during he talks about like there's a Q&A for a film, and it was Korean Americans about the Korean American experience, I think. And these Korean Americans were crying about like being from an immigrant family, being forced to live in America, and the actual Korean Americans, the actual Koreans who were from Korea, were just kind of staring befuddled at them because they had no idea what basically intuitively didn't understand what they were talking about. And I thought that was an extremely fascinating interplay of both this idea of for the Asian American, the only thing they have is a modernity. It's just modernity all the way down. There is no trad option. There is, I have a Japanese friend, and he's very into Mishima. He is very much a reactionary, right? There is a romantic figure like Mishima, like the Japanese approach to modernity, where they were given enough breathing space to allow their mythos, allow their religion, allow their society to kind of tame modernity, to warp around it, and incorporate it into the grand tradition of trying to kill Koreans, you know. But with the rest of well, I would like to hear your point of this. Like, why is it that there isn't for the Asian American? Why is it that there is no trad option? Why isn't there? It's only 100 layers of kind of like gaseous like liberalism.
That is a fantastic question, and it's something that I've thought about, and the somewhat difficult position that I'm in is that I am myself so fundamentally deracinated and so disconnected from actual, say, mainline Chinese culture, as it were, that my reference points are very sparse, right? Because I think to really answer that question, I would need to have a better mental model of say what is it that constitutes, say, Chinese culture or Japanese culture or Korean culture or East Asian culture, right? And obviously we're going to tend to group these things together, right? Not purely just because of raw phenotypic similarity, but also just because of similar sort of historical developmental trajectories as these countries have all sort of met modernity, right? Um, and the simplest inference, though, that I can make is essentially that there really is, there really does not appear to be anything in East Asian culture writ large that is sufficiently mimetically robust to survive a, face-to-face contact with liberalism. And that really is the sort of inference that I've made. And I'll just give you a couple of examples, right? Um, if you interact with, you know, say, mainlanders, even those who are very nationalistic, you know, they generally will not try to persuade you of anything. In that there's no real attempt to kind of evangelize that their system is superior in some respect, right? Say, and when I say system specifically, I mean, the political system in the PRC or what have you. And that idea of a kind of universalism of this being the best possible thing in all contexts isn't really doesn't really seem to be there. They might, in my experience, they might react if someone presses them on a particular point, say over Taiwan or something to that effect, or they make some sort of critique of the country. But short of that, they're not trying to flip any kind of opinion when they come to you. And I think one of the conclusions that I've made is that belief systems that are the most robust are by definition universalist slash totalizing. And when those belief systems come into contact with systems that are more provincial and more relativistic, I think the universalist belief system tends to take root and ultimately succeed. It sort of overpowers the thing. Where did you drop off? I didn't quite catch the exact moment.
No, yeah, I'm sorry about that. That was all on me, man. I apologize about that.
It's all good.
But you were just talking about how fundamentally that you were deracinated, and you're talking about how despite distinctly Korean, Japan, and China, they're all distinct ethnicities and peoples, they still have some shared collective history of being forcibly exposed to modernity in a sense.
Yeah, that's correct. And so what I mean very broadly is that if you look at the major East Asian countries and societies, obviously there are very important historical and regional and cultural and linguistic differences, etc., etc. But I think conceptually, uh, they very broadly followed similar technological and economic developmental sort of trajectories, right? And when they immigrate here, they seem to follow similar trajectories as immigrants. And really, the point that I was making is that I don't have a, I won't claim to have any sort of deep knowledge of the particularities of those cultures or their domestic value systems and et cetera, et cetera. What I do have are observations that I've made when I interact with people who have recently come over from those areas. And the point that I was making is really that liberalism melts everything. It is the mimetic robustness and the mimetic power of liberalism with a capital L is, I think if you view it in historical context, it is truly astonishing, right? And one of the inferences that I've made based on my interactions with, say, people who've just come over or more recently have come over from, say, mainland China, is that the to the extent that they have belief in their own, say, political system, right, in the mainland, in the PRC, that that belief isn't something that they really ever attempt to kind of evangelize or to convince an American of, right? And conversely, it is the intrinsic nature of liberalism, which is a totalizing moral system, right, downstream from, say, axiomatic beliefs in the universality of human rights. It is the intrinsic nature of this system to seek universal moral dominion over everything and everyone, right? Because there's a real asymmetry. Yeah, I'll give you an example. It's at least in previous eras, it was not uncommon for, uh, say, someone from uh, China to come to the US and then to be educated in one of our elite liberal institutions in the humanities, and then to effectively become a sort of evangelist for liberalism with a capital L, right? That's a very common trajectory for people. Many of these people are journalists for example, extremely hawkish national security publications like the Washington Post or something to that effect, or the New York Times, etc. Conversely, the inverse trajectory is not very common at all, right? You know, how many Westerners do you see moving over there who are then ultimately converted to either arguing for some variant of socialism or alternatively arguing for, and I don't even know what the term here would be, but let's just say, cultural, I don't even fucking know, Confucianism or whatever, right? But that's not a trajectory that really exists. I mean, in Japan, you have that to an extent. You have obviously, sort of weeb culture, but even weeb culture is something that happens at the margins. The the desire to become Japanese is pales in comparison to the desire to become American, or at least culturally American, right? Now, I don't know if that very long-winded answer satisfies your question.
No, it's a great answer, and you notice with the weebism, it's kind of pornographic. It's a plaything. It's not. There's no power to it. There's no threat. It's weebism is not threatening. The American Empire is not threatened by people wanting to LARP as samurai, or the Edo period. It's different than, let's say, wanting to be an actual apparatchik of, let's say, China, or let's say Islam. Japan has been defanged and it's became a product, even without issues of immigration or ethnos or anything like it happening in Europe. You see, with Japan, it's even for just being a pure liberalism has been killing them off. Basically, they're completely submerged in liberalism.
Yeah,
Like, even
that's
for
a very
them, their
interesting
their identity is just a
observation.
plaything.
That's a very interesting observation, and I look, if I can be frank for a moment, my mental model of Japan is that it's that it's not really a sovereign country based on the way that they have to operate within the broader sort of American containment system, i.e., the island chain system. Uh, but B, I think even more fundamentally, and I just want to be clear, this is not in any way to like sort of romanticize Imperial Japan, which was, committed all sorts of innumerable horrific atrocities, across East Asia and Southeast Asia. But I think fundamentally, I view them as a sort of conquered people, right? And it is hard for me to articulate how and why I have that intuition, you might argue that it's an over extrapolation from their political leadership being these sort of kind of very feckless sort of vassals in comparison to the American hegemon. But it's a very sort of it's an intuition that I get just from sort of surface level observations of their orientation towards, I think, the U.S. in particular. And when you say liberalism has conquered them, it's I won't say that I know enough about Japanese social dynamics to weigh in on that with a lot of precision. But I do think it's interesting that Biden, for example, recently criticized them as being as being xenophobic, which is a very strange thing to say about your number one ally in East Asia. But I think that was such a revealing moment, wasn't it? Right? Because you know, when you look at the globe-spanning American empire, what I find incredibly fascinating is that the legitimating moral, uh, the legitimating moral framework of liberalism seems to be able to continually renew and update itself over time, right? Are you familiar with that meme where it shows two planes, dropping bombs over the Middle East? And one of them is like
One has a gay
one of the
flag.
American. Exactly, exactly,
Yeah, the one has
right?
a gay flag. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I think it just shows I think the mimetic robustness and flexibility of the system, right? That we can kill 50. I mean, I don't even know what the figure was. 50,000 people in Afghanistan. Was it 100,000? Right. And then when they say maybe we should stop doing this, well, NBC has these concerned pieces about, well, what about women's rights or something like that, right? And uh, it's really incredible. Like it's like my mental model. I mean, I haven't read Yarvin closely on this, but I think if when you think about say progressive moral values as being the lineal descendant of Protestantism, i.e., a sort of secular Protestantism, that to me feels very intuitively correct. But I don't know enough about like the strict details on that to argue that with a lot of depth.
Sorry, what was that? You broke up. Did the literal descendant of what?
Protestantism, Protestantism
Yes.
in general, yeah.
Yeah, that's the classic mold bug line. The idea of that universalism, that the Anglo-Protestantism, the idea of universalizing everything. It's all about you talked about this in one of your pieces about liberalism is just a never-ending series of oughts. It's never about what it is. It's always about oughts, and it's about a word selling your way into a Tower of Babel of oughts. And so they use this as a rhetorical weapon, and especially with Japan. Like Japan has been doing nothing but being like a puppy that you can kick over and over again. It's a glorified military base. And them saying like, "Oh, you're being xenophobic," is the State Department saying, "Hey, we might have some refugees. We might need to drop by Japan, and there's nothing you can do about it." And that's basically what they're saying. To be a servant or a vassal of the American Empire is the inability to tell them no. And with an American, as in any vassal, they never take yes for an answer. You could always be doing more as a vassal to the American Empire.
I think that is a very elegant summation. To be a vassal basically means you can't say no, right? Broadly speaking, there are probably two, truly sovereign countries in Asia. It's China and North Korea, right? Although
True.
none of us, I'm sure, would want to live in North Korea sort of thing. But I mean, even there, right? It's one of the interesting things about Gaza is the comparison between the strategic bombing of the quote unquote strategic bombing of Gaza and the strategic bombing of East Asia, say during the Korean War. Right? There's this famous quote from Curtis LeMay where he makes this sort of offhand comment that they're like, oh, I think we killed about 15% of the entire population in North
Yeah.
Korea, right? And it's very interesting, right, to think about like how would the American public have reacted if there were ubiquitous smartphones that could video out all these like napalm children in the same way that we can see that footage from Gaza, which has obviously been immensely radicalizing and is, I think, in my view, this enormous crisis for liberalism's internal legitimacy at this point, right? And to bring it back to literature, it's very interesting to see the sort of quote unquote high caste literati react to what's happening there on the ground now and seeing it's sort of a mask off moment for where allegiances are at the highest level of literary culture right now. So it's quite interesting to see all these things evolve. Um, and of course, abstracted from the horror on the ground in the region, which is
Well, I mean, it's just it's a spectacle of torture at this point. It truly is a spec. I mean, you see, Yarvin made this interesting point about the protesting, and you see like flickers of the 20th century. Everyone in a protest is basically high. They behave high, they act high. Both sides, like you have the manic high of the pro-Zionist, and you have this almost Dionysian lust of like the Palestinians. Sorry, of the American, like the student companies, the student protesters of Palestine. And that's what Yarvin talks about. The clear pill is like all 90%, like 10% or 20% of this isn't actually like politically legitimate, but the mass around it, it's just people getting high off of energy exposure that they get to project some this idea of empathy or this idea of morality. It's an energizer. It's the same thing with the radical Protestants of the old is you feel righteous, you feel moral, you feel, and all of this is based on spectacle of a country, of a people, the Israelis, who basically carve themselves a beautiful little exception. Like they are, I mean, let's be honest, they are colonial, right? And you see this kind of weird push and pull with the American Jews or American Israelis, right? Who have this weird thing is that they've been with the neoliberal. They've been a Brahmin for such a long time in this country. They've been at the peak of the PMC class. But then you have this one exception where their own coalition is no longer allowing them to have this little slice of exception. Israel no longer gets the exception. And you can see this for generations to come. Israel, if you look at their birth rates, Yarvin also has a good piece on this. If you look at Israel's only going to become more right wing in the future, right? Because the only people having kids in Israel is the ridiculously radical Jews, not the Nazi kind of classy bourgeoisie Jews. So the future of Israel is just going to be more and more colonial, more and more right wing. And the future of both Europe and, Europe is going to be becoming, mostly more pro Muslim, let's say, and America, just due to the sheer ideology of America and of the left. The left where the ratchet is just going to go to such a radical degree that they're no longer going to consider Israelis the honorable exception. They're going to now allow no exceptions. So even in terms of art and in terms of culture, you're going to see this weird fracturing of identity is going to play a big part in a big, very big, big way in the next 10 to 15 years on that front.
yeah. I mean, you just there's so many threads to pull on there, right? That are interesting, right? I think one thread is what's the psychology of protesters on both sides at this point. The second thread is what is the ultimate trajectory of Israel more broadly, and then the third thread is like how will our system change in response to all of this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And look, I won't pretend to be a sort of geopolitical expert in the region by any means. Certainly, I've followed the events very closely out of personal interest and horror. I think there is a lot of psychologizing around, what's motivating these protests. I think at the end of the day, if you're live streaming the mass murder of 15,000 plus children, people are going to protest, right? Like it's not, I think, I think the impulse for any, and like I read some of Yarmin's commentary on this, and I read also Sam Chris is an American, I think he's a Jewish American journalist who wrote a response piece to Yarmin's take on Gaza, which is very good. And I think that a lot of the time, if I think the internet economy incentivizes contrarian takes almost as a sort of market differentiator,
Right.
right? And I very much agree that there are all these layers of complexity, in terms of what's happening socially and culturally and politically and so forth. But, I've seen, like yesterday, I saw an image of, two dead boys, one of whom appeared to be holding his slightly younger brother, and the younger brother whose eyeball had been popped out of its socket, right? And like it is just, like I think it's reasonable for college students to be upset about that, given the fact that we're actively supporting all this killing and whatnot, right? So what I think is very interesting is, well, not interesting. I think I'm the real doomer here. Is I agree with you about the demographic thing. I have some friends and journalists who are more plugged into, the region, and I think the consensus is very much that this rightward shift is driven by demographic tailwinds, and basically, like another half generation or so, or however long it'll take, there's going to be no brakes on that train. They're just gonna, you know, start a massive regional war, like deliberately, and the U.S. will get pulled in, right? And we'll probably end up fighting Iran. Like oil will go to $200 a barrel, and it's going to be like a massive, massive shit show because Iran is like not anything close to Iraq in terms of like how quote unquote easy it would be for the U.S. to take them on. So, anyways, sorry, I didn't mean to digress too much into like contemporary
No, this that
geopolitics.
was a fantastic answer. I saw some of your tweets on the matter. I was genuinely curious on getting your takes on the political matters. And
Oh, okay, good, yeah. I don't want to derail things too much, so yeah, just let me know if I'm veering too far.
well, to actually tie that into your overall work is this idea of the ratchet of the mission creep of the of both politics and identity, is that basically we're currently in a tract and say even in our fields, the artist establishment is dying. The hegemon of like literary. There's no salon. There's no Harold Bloom anymore. There's no the establishment doesn't even try to give a sense of any culture or any sense of wisdom or eldership. There is no wise elders of literature in America anymore. Not really. It is just a bunch of very clicky, as you posted demographics. Women or women in their menopausal 30s and plus. It really is. It's a gynocracy basically, and it's very clicky and it's very circular. And I 100% agree. You talked about this your pod and Leafbox about the idea of the MFA as kind of a circular firing squad, and that's what it is. Because the human, you can't write. I'm gonna write what I want to write because you're doing it collectively. Oh, is Stacy gonna think about? Oh, I need to edit this, and edit this. You're gonna have a stage fright. Stage fright is built into the MFA program. That plus the weird oligarchical kind of incestuous of current day publishing. Anything authentically persona based is completely ripped apart, and that's what makes the decentralized internet so interesting with us, is that it's the polar opposite. You have to be hyper personalized, you have to be hyper unique, you have to be hyper. Listen, this is my brand. This is who I am. You have to be up in people's faces. The incentive structure for decentralized fiction is completely the polar opposite ratchet than the actual mainstream ratchet.
I completely agree. Right? I mean, it's sort of funny because I constantly shit on MFA programs, even though I've never and anything. So, so maybe maybe other people might make that counter argument, but I think none of I think none of my observations are unique to me. I think what what makes me excited to write about this stuff is the kind of theory that brings everything together. Right? I'll give you a specific example. When I talk about a writing group as a circular firing squad, that in part is a sort of extrapolation from experiments that have been done in social psychology. I remember there's one particular experiment, and it's sort of funny because just as a sidebar here, a lot of landmark experiments in social psychology ended up failing to replicate or were sort of invented wholesale out of wholesale cloth, right?
Right.
But there were a couple ones that I remember from Psychology 101. One was I think there was some experiment where they had everybody in the room stand up. They were all actors, just spontaneously stand up, right? And then the subject of the experiment, not knowing what to do, would almost every single time, like invariably, stand up with them, sort of thing. And not to be overly scientific about it, but like obviously anybody who spent any amount of time in college/university in modern day America, right, / the West, etc., knows that social pressure for moral conformity increases the deeper you go into humanities, right? And I think part of my mental model of the modern culturally elite, ultra high status literary fiction author, think for example somebody like a Zadie Smith or an Ocean Vuong, if you wanted to pick an Asian American, is that I think to some degree, these people are, in a sense, kind of moral entrepreneurs. In that, it's not that the works themselves are intrinsically or primarily didactic, but I think there's a sort of implicit moral framework that is loaded into these works. And that moral framework is, of course, whatever the kind of avant garde leading edge of secular progressive morality is, right? And if you're in a group of people who are sort of just ready to kind of catch you for a failure of representation, be it racial representation or gender representation or what have you, right? That is very much an anxiety, right? And I just can't imagine. There was one point when I was younger, I actually considered going to an MMA program. And this was before things got, I think, really, really heated. I'm not sure when you would place peak woke. Maybe you would place it like 2016 or something to that effect, 2017, 2018. I don't really know. But I think if I had gone into one of these programs, I would never have been able to, obviously, I would never have been able to write in so.
Absolutely not. Yeah.
Like, I'm sure they would have reported me to DHS or some shit like that. But I think what would have happened was that I would have compromised, and I wouldn't even probably have brought it into the circle. I would have written something else, and I can tell you, I actually did do some writing courses, and when I did and these were, I don't remember what the term is. It's sort of like adult education or continuing education. So this was when I was, well past, being 23 or 24 or whatever. I was thinking about this every day. And when I did this writing group with a bunch of other people, it wasn't a college sort of thing. I didn't actually bring my incel manuscript in there because I just knew that people were going to be like, "What the fuck is this? Are you insane?
Yeah.
Are you how mentally ill is this guy? What the fuck is going on with this dude?"
Uh,
Holy shit, right?
That'd be hilarious to see. I would. You should write. You should write a story about that. Actually, auto fiction. That'd be beautiful.
Right, right. So I think, see, I don't think that a writing group or circle is necessarily always going to be super constricting. I think the political environment or rather the constitution of the group is the modulator that will determine how stifling or how generative it is for the individual who is participating, right?
Right.
And obviously in this era, like there's only one type of book you can write if you're in an MFA program. And I'll give basically the Overton window is too strict. I'll give you one example of a guy who is like very, very clever in terms of going right to the very edge of the line, right to the outer edge of the boundary of the Overton window without overtly transgressing it. And I don't know if you've read this short story. It's an N+1. It's by an Asian American male writer named Tony Tillotson. The story is called The Feminist. And I won't sort of spoil it for you, but it's a very, very funny and inventive story about this guy who is a sort of overly eager and obsequious incel. And in the end, of course, he sort of becomes kind of like radicalized, but it's in a very funny kind of sort of comic sort of way, but without any of the really hard edged psychology and interiority that you see with my protagonist in my novel.
It's the meme
But
idea of the incel. It's the mimetic concept of it.
exactly, exactly. Because as much as I love that story, I think it's very inventive and clever and well executed. The writer of the story, who's I think is a very talented novelist. I think he's a great novelist. But you could tell, like if you know anything about the interiority of an alienated young man, like that shit is way more hardcore than what is depicted in this short story. Right? It's
Right.
closer to what's depicted in my novel, and that's not to position my novel as like, oh fuck yeah, I'm so much better than Tony or whatever. I don't believe that. I think he's an amazing writer and all that. But part of the freedom of being a faceless fucking loser that nobody in the literary establishment gives a fuck about, you know, is that you actually can quote unquote go full retard to make a millennial reference. You're probably too young to understand this reference. Do you know what I'm
I was conscious during the full retard era.
were you? Okay.
I'm not that much
Okay,
of a
yeah.
baby.
Yeah. Well, yeah, which is sort of funny because I actually thought that I actually pulled back a bunch of stuff in my novel too because I thought the character was too intensely like psychologically dysphoric and whatnot. But at the end of the day, I think pseudonymity as a kind of social technology for art is not a new development, right? And obviously you can go back and
Go back and oh, hopefully it didn't freeze on your end. Jesus, Han.
you know, end up on, their equivalent of like an SPLC list or something. I'm just kidding, SPLC, don't come after me.
Hey, listen. You're a faceless retard with a really cool avatar. All right, that's the thing. Your aesthetic is too damn interesting, so it makes it a very easy target for the SPLC.
Yeah, look, the other thing too is that you know, I have checked out of the as much as I have fun writing obliquely about culture war adjacent topics, right? In terms of like these kind of systems level analyses of how overly strident progressive morality has constricted creative expression. As much as I sort of kind of obliquely engage with kind of culture war stuff, I am minimally engaged with like the actual culture war writ large, right? And I just don't want to be. I just, I don't have like the HP for that stuff. and nor is it like my main focus, in life to like be, the right or the left wing version of that per se. And even the stuff that I do care about is just like you'll see, for example, like I sort of like kind of like semi-autistically post about like niche like military shit or whatever around the U.S. versus China just because it's so interesting, right? Like even there, like I'm not getting limbically activated in the way that somebody is about like I don't know, the latest right left moral panic or what have you. Because I think all of that again, it's just my view is that it's all overdetermined. It's all just kind of overdetermined, and the trajectory is the trajectory. And what is going to matter 10, 20 years from now I think, the really, really good works of art that were made by weird losers like us. And I mean that completely unironically, right? Because, like nobody's going to care about who the culture warriors were and whatnot, but I truly do believe that, great, like, good and great works can be remembered many years later.
What I'm hearing from this is that you care much more about the emergent mechanics of that are just all this culture war stuff is just like shrapnel from an explosion that's a million miles off, and that only like people like us who are away from the zeitgeist can really detect and even look for it in a lot of sense. I mean, no, I mean, look at EAC. Look at all the current techno bubble, right? They're all talking about EAC, accelerationism. Land was just a guy on his blog in 2012, 2014, right? And he was talking about techno acceleration and AI all the way back in the 90s, but no one was talking about land in the 90s or 2000s. It talks about for such a long time, but then suddenly people hear train slam basically, and they're like, what the hell happened? And the reason why for this what the hell happened aspect is because the zeitgeist is programmed by design. It functionally cannot observe the little 100% of shattered shrapnels that we do, right? Because we're trying to look for, like you said, you talked about this a little bit in we are all sci-fi writers now about the future is coming quicker at us than we can perceive it as writers. So we have no choice but to have basically, you know, to use a video game term, like open access writing. Our novels are always in beta in a sense that we constantly have to update to even somewhat reflect the reality around us.
Gabe, I think you have a real talent for very elegant metaphors. Because honestly, I think that's a great metaphor, right? Like, uh, this idea of just observing the mechanics of everything as it's happening, I think that is the thing that's sort of interesting to me, like sort of the systems level or the analysis of like how does secular progressive morality work and how does it affect culture? That's very interesting to me. And yeah, like I I haven't read Land deeply, and I can say that prior to writing my novel, the only Land piece that I read was Hellbait, which is this very interesting short blog post. Do you know what this post? You know what I'm referencing? You probably remember it.
Yes, yeah, I made sure to look it up before I reread it right before this interview. It's a great piece.
Good, good man. Yeah,
It's something
actually,
right out of Anon's brain, basically.
yeah. And like man, it is so interesting to see convergent thought because I've been thinking about a lot of stuff that Land had been writing about, but I didn't actually read him with any depth. In the process of writing a novel, with the exception of that blog post, right? And this very sort of nihilistic like leaning into the nihilism of evolutionary theory, is a sort of thing that most scientists don't do. Scientists don't want to go around saying, this is like a meaning shredder, right? There are few scientists or philosophers who really want to do that. But more broadly, yeah, I read Xenosystems Fragments maybe a couple of months ago, and I mean, just being able to have the foresight to see, how important AI would be and how big of a deal that would be, I think is like pretty impressive. And the as a like, I think my understanding is that you would group him as a continental philosopher as opposed to an analytic philosopher.
Oh,
Right? An analytic
absolutely.
philosopher,
All
yeah,
his influences were continental: Deleuze, Guattari, Kant.
right, yeah. And so when I read a book like that, it's not so much the the specific arguments are not interesting. I think it's more that what's interesting is that he was able to anticipate a sort of technologically driven nihilism that was to be brought about by the advent of machine intelligence, which he, I think, refers to as Skynet. I think having the foresight to see that it would be a driver of nihilism is very impressive, right? And but I won't pretend to have read him closely or deeply, so I'm not an expert of his by any means, and I'm not endorsing I don't know whatever his prescriptive stuff is. I mean, I barely understand half the shit that was in that book, to be honest. But I think
A common response to that.
I think I remember I read a Guardian piece about Land's connection to like Adam Waffen or something, and like how he inspired white nationalist accelerationism. And then I read that piece like a couple of years back, and then I read Xenosystems Fragments, and I was like, I don't understand how you could possibly make that argument. Like it didn't make any sense to me. But I know like I know there's a lot of like spicy stuff in his work and all that. But the stuff I think that's really interesting is the stuff around artificial intelligence as the the next major driver of nihilism in human society. So artificial machine intelligence is a sort of meaning shredder, right? So if liberalism is the identity shredder, and if Land talks about like modern techno-capital as a IQ shredder, I think the most interesting foresight that he had, in my view, is machine intelligence as a meaning shredder, right? And as you know, I've written about that in my Substack as well. And that, like, I, I've since sort of tweaked my expectations based on what I've seen some other people write online. I don't think large language models or LLMs will replace the top echelon of really sophisticated literary novelists. I do think that they will come for genre writers, probably fairly soon, I think. But it, I think that's a good example of automation just like shredding human meaning, right? And it's all like, in a sense, it's a great time to be an artist because of distribution. And in another sense, maybe we'll all wish we were like boomers and we were all like, at the peak of like global literary and print culture when it comes to novels, like a couple of years from now. Who knows?
Yeah, at the end, you're going to be begging for the grill back. You're going to be missing that damn grill.
Yeah.
Well, see, well, that's interesting. Well, the thing with Land is that the only thing vaguely interesting to him about humans is intelligence. For him, there's no difference between intelligence and capital, and the only telos in his system is the maximalization of capital, aka intelligence. Because for him, they're the same thing. They're based on eugenic pressures, based on technology, based on everything. These are all tied into the same pressured out point, which is just the maximalization of intelligence. Because in order to function with capital, you need a bare minimum of intelligence, the filter. Capitalism is an inherent filter for intelligence. So for him, he just wants the only. That's why he's a meaning shredder, because he's the very bottom. You know what I mean? That's why when I read your book, when I read your review that you never read Land beforehand, other than that one piece, I both found it very shocking because they just went so well together. When I was reading your piece for the first time for the review, I had a local Panera bread and I just bought West Martian's very cheap Very good, by the way. Highly recommend publication of Xenosystems fragments in paperback. And I remember I would read a little bit of NRX theory, and I would go to your book, and I'll be like, wait a minute. And that there'd be certain keywords and these very emotions, evocations of how, Anon would express himself in these concepts, especially with that scene with that scene I talked about with the implied telos, right? When he anthropomorphizes Darwin as like a weird Cthulhu-like creature, and very like describes it as cosmic horror. I was having a blast. I'm like, this is actually just pure Landyism right here. This is Landyism put into fiction, right? It was great. I read a lot of normie reviews of your work, and they described it as disturbing or like terrifying or something. I just had a ball with it. I thought it was immensely fun because I was at the end point of the sociopath trap. I'm like, yeah, this is a ball. I got my best friend Nick Land to watch this movie with me. He's giving commentary. I thought it was just a pure blast from people like me. And the fact that it was totally emergent, it actually makes it even more delicious from that point of view. That this is it's just in the air. It's in the air, and you're kind of just catching it in the atmosphere, basically. And you kind of personified it in Anon, because Anon is a vessel. He's kind of like an avatar of this, because he has no identity of his own, not really. He is just kind of at the whims of certain spirits. And we'll get more into that later, but I find it extremely amusing that actually kind of beautiful that you didn't read Land beforehand of writing of Incel.
So actually, I want to jump on that a little bit because I have an idea of how it happened. Let me just sort of explain to you because the prose and the the way that uh, the character's cognition is represented in his internal dialogue slash the prose of the novel was actually the thing that I put the most work into.
I
So
can tell.
yeah, I appreciate that. The narrative structure of this book was largely done a number of years ago, but it wasn't. I think the prose took a very, very long time. It was an incredibly laborious but also joyful experience of polishing that. And the inception of the idea was to take somebody who's sort of hyper analytically observing otherwise banal social interaction and to dial that up to a very high level of sort of quasi-autistic intensity while also actually integrating what are real social observations. And then that was half of the core of the idea. The second half of the core of the idea was taken out of cognitive science. When I was younger, I took this course in cognitive science. And one of the things that was really interesting to me was in cognitive science, the way it works is the scientists will abstract human cognition into using metaphorical computer science concepts. So, for example, um, like there's purportedly, according to functional magnetic resonance imaging, that's a live view of the blood flow in the brain. There's purportedly a region of the brain that you can identify as being like a cheating detection module or something like that. Like it just lights up if you think somebody's lying or something, right?
Right.
Now, like my memory of this is a little bit hazy, so those details are not going to be exactly on point. But as another example, there's a region that only recognizes faces, right? So if you have a stroke in this region of the brain, you can't like you're quote unquote face blind. You can't recognize faces, which is really interesting. And what I wanted to do was to drive the metaphor of the man as a computer to the maximum possible degree of intensity by having his interior experience um, labeled in this way. So instead of having this like typical veridical experience of like, oh, I'm talking to a girl or whatever, or this or that, he has this sort of almost like kind of like a heads up display in his own brain that's like popping different notifications into his conscious awareness as interactions are unfolding in this very sort of computational way. And that to me got me really excited because I hadn't really seen that type of very specific hyper analytical social autism represented in literary fiction ever. And I think the way that Land also linked into it more directly was I used to. I think one of the most interesting writers in the dissident right sphere is Zero H.P. Lovecraft. Now, I I can just as like a basic framing device. I don't really understand like his politics like too well or anything like that. I wouldn't say like I'm aligned with whatever it is that he's advocating, which I don't really even fully like know with any great deal of precision. But one of the things that he first of all, he's a really good science, like he's a really stellar science fiction writer. Like Good Economy is a really is a phenomenal story, I think, and so is Don't Make Me Think. I think was very underrated. I think Don't Make Me Think was are you familiar with that? It was one of the emojis.
Yes, yes, you linked it in one of your pieces talking about a review. It's yeah, he's a great work. We just reviewed one of his works recently in a magazine. He's absolutely probably one of the best writers in our scene. I agree. He's probably top 3 to be honest with you.
Yeah, yeah. I think he's the most interesting one in the whole sphere. Is my feeling. Um, but anyhow, his writing, I think that was the most interesting, just conceptually, right? To me, is that were actually his Twitter threads where he would use computer science metaphors to describe human social dynamics. So, like, I'm paraphrasing, but off the top of my head, he had, for example, a he had some thread where he talked about ideologies as having an attack surface, right? So he's sort of kind of like stacking metaphors in a really interesting way. And that type of language of sort of applying computer science concepts to cognition, and I'm like, this is not to say that I tried to write a character that was Zero H.P. Lovecraft, although I think I threw in like a joke about that into the novel or two. But um, the it's very interesting just to see how computation has been almost like integrated into the veridical human experience by people who are technically sophisticated, I would say, right? Yeah. And
No,
so that was to a degree an influence on the way that I wrote the prose. Is what I need to say.
yeah, and what's interesting about the pros is that the way he views, I 100% agree with that. And for his politics, I think if I remember correctly, ZHP is like a classical, like NRX neo-reactionary. Like he was there during the old head days of the blogosphere, and one of the intrinsic parts of NRX was to take biological determinism to its absolute endpoint. And you made this one comment, I believe, in reference to Chris Lee's comment, is that the horror of incel isn't at evolutionary psychology at its most extreme. It's the horror of it is it's neuroscience at its most basic, which I thought was a great line because it's basically a horseshoe. Basically, like these two endpoints, Nick Land and me on the end, and then the very basic idea of neuroscience. The most basic conceit, they're basically 100% the same thing. The spiral at the end of the spiral is kind of aligned with its own tail at that. You once you get into that ride, once you take the first step into neuroscience, you're already locked into the roller coaster, baby. It just more the curl just tightens deeper and deeper and deeper as you go. And I thought that was a brilliant comment that you made in reference to that.
Yeah, thank you, man. I look. My view is that there's a tremendous amount of blatant nihilism in that is sort of just appears to be like embedded in neuroscience in general, like right. And I think this hasn't overtly made its way into the culture that much, but I think it has nonetheless seeped through. And around, say, discussions around free will in particular, right? There was like more popularly, Sam Harris wrote. I mean, I think Sam Harris is a fucking moron. I really don't like Sam Harris, but
Well,
he
that's a
wrote.
controversial take.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, he just has like the most awful take on like everything, as far as I can tell. But he wrote a popular book on the myth of free will, right? So obviously he's an incompatibilist. He doesn't think that determinism is compatible with free will, and I'm also an incompatibilist, but I remember reading this book, and I had read a whole bunch of free will literature, like just academic philosophy stuff too. And this was when I was a young man, and I was thinking about it, and I just couldn't understand how this wasn't a bigger deal. Like, because the conclusions are very radical, right? You know,
Absolutely.
it's actually pretty hard to get to moral responsibility once accept the basic precepts of neuroscience, right? And I like I will not. I'm not interested in entering into like complex philosophical debates about this. There's one book that I'd recommend in particular on this stuff that's very accessible for most. It's called Just Desserts by Greg Caruso and the now deceased Daniel Dennett. And it's a back and forth debate between an incompatibilist on free will versus compatibilist. It's a fantastic book. And Greg Caruso has written a number of great books on the topic. But to bring it back to Inceldom, I think the discontinuity, and I mentioned this on a Leafbox podcast, the discontinuity between Holden Caulfield and the modern incel is not just the further disintegration of, social fabric and under like liberalism or whatever, right? I don't think it's just that. I think there's this undercurrent of new scientifically slash reductionist driven nihilism that has really like flung it even further ahead, and uh, maybe you disagree with that hypothesis. I mean, I know I think you're a pretty young guy from what I recall.
I'm
So
actually the same age as Anon. I'm 23.
yeah,
So
you're very impressively well read for a guy that young. I have to say I'm impressed by that.
it's the power of autism.
Yeah, I mean, do you like? I'll give you an example. Classically, it seems like incels are really obsessed with a kind of social determinism born out of, say some combination of facial measurements and muscularity and stuff like that, right? Um, do you agree with my hypothesis that there's this like additional layer of it's like the alienation of the young modern man feels like it has more of a theoretical scientific basis, and that's actually why it's more potent and worse than it was, say, in the 50s or in any other era.
Oh, absolutely. Because if you compare, I remember Leafbox also compared Anon to Holden Caulfield, and I would have to just disagree. Because if you read, I just recently did a video of Hudson on Catching the Rye. I read it recently. Holden is absolutely a word cell. He's a deeply social guy. He's desperate to talk to anyone. He's actually a deeply he's a theater kid basically. He's nothing like Anon, who's a stem cell who can't communicate worth a damn. You know, Holden is 100% a romantic. He is stuck. He's a cosmopolitan romantic, stuck in a very modern world. And with Anon, it's the opposite. He is more, in a lot of ways, he's much more in tune with modern reality than the people around him. That's what the disconnect is between him and the world. It's the exact opposite of Holden Caulfield. And this idea of nihilism and this idea, because you mentioned that in your review, or is that the incel is like the quintessential subject of modernity. Because yet again, due to the acid bath of modernity, the acid bath of capitalism or liberalism, whatever you want to call it, due to the acid bath, the only thing, it melts down everything about you except the most foundational aspect of you, which is you as an organism, aka you as a Darwinistic subject. The thick, slimy, collagic eel that is Darwinism is shielding you from acid. And of course, being a collagical eel, Darwinism is fundamentally disgusting. So when you look at incels as a nihilistic creature, a nihilistic being, you have to realize that when you're sexually frustrated as a man in America, and let's say, a white guy or whatever, or like to just be hegemon complete, you have to realize the answers every time, hey, how do I talk to a girl? I was homeschooled for the vast majority of my time, and so I had no fiat. I had no technological fiat. I had some cultural fiat via media and so forth. But when I got interested in this conflict, I'm like, what makes a girl attractive? I know what makes me attracted to them. I mean, I had boners randomly in like Marshalls and looking at glasses. That was weird. That happened really abruptly. But this weird sexual impulse start flooding you, and as from a lived experience, I guess, you realize that the people who are answering you, oh, it's your personality, or it's X, Y, and Z, it just comes off as fundamentally lies. And that's kind of like the initial what we used to call back in the day, red pilling, not only in the manosphere context, but also in the neo-reactionary, because it happened with Gamergate, if you remember that fiasco, right? Everything liberalism finally cracked. And like you used this term earlier, it's seeped in, like seeped. And that's a beautiful term. The eel of reality finally seeped into everyone else. We were the first conduits because yet again we were outside anyway, so we were fully exposed to this beforehand. So for me, when I discovered this facial physiognomy or reason why women don't like you is because you're less than 6 foot, or all these explanations, for me it was much more uplifting. I liked the fact that there was an actual rigid set of rules. It was like, to use a very showing my age here, it was like Pokemon. It was like when I used to play Pokemon on my DS as a kid. Okay, there's actually a structured mechanism of why I feel this way, why the others feel this way towards me, and how I can do, or what can I do to interact with the world around me. But of course, so I celebrated biological determinism, or kind of felt deeply liberated, like enlightened. Like again, Nick Lance turned darkly enlightened about this. So with the incels, the reason why incels are so fundamentally is because to be an incel, I think the only guy to study incels is a guy named William Costello. Very interesting guy. I highly recommend his work. And is that they are overwhelmingly neurodivergent. They are disagreeable by nature, suicidally, like the mission creep of incels. Like when I actually am writing a review I'm writing a piece for a Man's World. I plan to submit to a Man's World on your book, actually. I call it The Son of Non as an NRX reference. And I say in the piece, if you were to give Han's book to anyone on incel.is or whatever incel site there is, they'd hate it. I genuinely think most incels, self-described incels, would hate your book because they were so encapsulated in their worldview. They're so encapsulated by this. They're basically what we'd call overdosed on red pills, is that they have a ratchet effect upon themselves, that they get that no, basically that fundamentally that they know that they're inferior. They know this, and it's the truth, but they want to embrace it as their own. They embrace their own inferiority, if that makes any sense.
Wow, there's so many threads to pull on there. Look, first of all, I'm holy shit. I am really interested in seeing that review at some point. So I hope it does get accepted in Man's World. That's awesome. And once again, thank you for engaging with my work. Um, yeah, so the first thread is this idea of being comforted by the underlying order in the universe, even if that order is one that is on some sense disturbing or deflating. And I think that the psychology of that is very interesting, right? Which is that it's one thing to suffer in this state of bewilderment. And for many people, there is a degree of that, there's a degree to which that suffering can be attenuated by feeling that they have an ordered theoretical explanation for that, right? And I think that's true for really anybody who's going through any kind of challenging or difficult experience, right? But even more fundamentally, I think there is just a kind of pleasure in understanding the system of a thing. And maybe this is a very kind of male-coded way of thinking. I'm not really sure, but I think some people, they just get a kick out of feeling that they have a better world model in reality, right? And then to form that third thread, this idea of how would a a person who's actually struggling with access to a meaningful relationship and being loved and all these other things, how would they react to my novel, particularly if they self-identify in this way. And I agree with your intuition. I think, broadly speaking, uh, they might find it upsetting. They might find it. I think the immediate reaction for many of them might simply be that they feel that they're being mocked. And as much as the book is very much a sort of kind of multi-layered black comedy in many ways, the the intention really is never from me to mock somebody who's in like deep psychic pain or whatever. That's absolutely, you know, not the intention of the way that I wrote that book. And I think that comes through particularly toward the end because I think one of the core through lines of the book is universal empathy, right? And I think at the same time, you're right. I think certainly self-identifying with a with a, a model of victimhood is on net generally going to be maladaptive for most people in most circumstances. I think, right? I'm not going to pretend I'm some mental health expert or anything like that. But I think this is just like, like a very kind of like basic intuition that most people have, right? Which is that the somewhat peculiar inversion of our current culture is such that there is a sort of kind of social gain that you can have from. Uh, Here I am treading on a culture war topic again, right? But the point just being that if you derive psychological pleasure from seeing yourself as disempowered, you have given what you're doing is you're wireheading yourself into being as disempowered as you can possibly be, right?
And
And that
taking
is
pride in that disempowerment, a very
correct,
particular
right?
pride.
And that is tautologically going to prevent you from taking action to improve your situation. Now, that is not to say that I think that if every quote unquote incel were to try hard enough that they'd be able to secure a meaningful relationship. I do not believe that. Certainly there are people who are quote unquote true selves due to, myriad, overlapping problems, right? And uh, you know, people who are born into sort of profound physical disability, and it's essentially logistically impossible for them, to even mechanically have, intercourse, like obviously there's a range of situations that people are in, but I think if you write a novel like this, the one does require a certain level of understanding from the reader of like tonally and conceptually and stylistically what it is that I'm doing. And if you don't get it, you're just not going to get it. And a lot of people just completely didn't get it, and that's okay. And that's okay. But I think a lot of the joy of making this was in layering in all these different levels of complexity. And that's not to say that it has some super complicated, like, I think the term is like Straussian / hidden meaning or anything like that. But just that there is a shit ton of density there, just in terms of like the sentences and like concepts and like the jokes and whatnot, right? But at the same time, look, I have tremendous empathy for any human being that is suffering, and I certainly am not like out here in any way, shape, or form to quote unquote be, dunking on guys who are like in many cases deeply depressed and or suicidal, right? That is 1,000,000% not what I want to do. But I do think that it's incredibly, ultimately, it's very rich narrative ground, basically.
No, because they are, like you said, they're the quintessential modern subject. And the thing is, because they're so quintessential, it gets to the core. When you write a novel like this, you're gonna get it's on the nerve. It's been on the nerve. It is the nerve. When there's no way to write this and not get on people's nerves. This is a nerval novel in a very embodied sense, and I'm actually surprised. You say you got negative review, negative. I'm surprised because of the people who are self-selected, kind of like a selection pressure. Most people who seem to have read your book actually seem to get it. I mean, you sold, well, other than the 150 free copies you got, you sold at least 100 plus copies at this point now organically.
Yeah. I think it's I would say it's closer to about 200 organic, and then 100. What happened with the 100 free was Isaac Simpson, as you know, has this blog slash podcast, and Arbogast, another pseudonymous writer, wrote I thought a very thoughtful review of the book, and it was posted on the carousel. And then I coincided the Tooky's mag, or I timed a free book promotion with the Tooky's mag review release and the carousel review release, and so that moved about 100 people downloaded, which was pretty exciting. And yeah, so I wouldn't say that the book has been negatively received per se, except perhaps initially on Lit. But some of the reviews that have come out, God bless Lit.
God bless them.
I don't have any hate for those guys. I'm thankful. I'm thankful for them because they led me to you guys, right? And so but again, more broadly, I think that reading some of the reviews, it was clear that like some the book is very quote unquote autistic slash detective systems novel, and it does get deep into certain particularities around, say, for example, Landian evolutionarily driven nihilism slash the particularities of how evolutionary psychology was wildly misinterpreted by the initial red pill writers into this insane fucked up uh like like black pill precursor,
Right.
and I think a lot of guys just are not like they some small fraction of readers, not most, but some small fraction read it, I think, in a superficial way. And I don't really blame him for it, because I think if you just don't have the background knowledge to know what I'm talking about in some of these more detailed narrative sequences, then that's just going to read some sci-fi genre writer overly enthusiastically describing a spaceship for 5 pages or something. What the fuck is this guy's problem?
Right, the sci-fi equivalent of Moby Dick, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the interesting idea of this scientification is the expectations of incel. Because I've said this multiple times. Incel is not the meme of the incel, and of course, the figure we all have, this deity, who also in this case a pseudo internet case, a spiritual deity is of course Elliot Rodger, right? Obviously, I mean the supreme gentleman. I remember I just recently was listening to, there's this shout out to this one guy. He runs this thing called AI audiobooks on Patreon. He did the entirety of Elliot Rodgers' book in Elliot Rodgers' voice. And it's, of course, I was listening to it for the meme factor, but I'm doing the dishes. And then there's a wonderful scene where early in his recounting of his relationship with his grandmother, when he's playing with female kids as a toddler at a very young age. And he says something along the lines of when we were getting changed for the pool, this was the first time I saw a woman naked, and the only time I ever saw a woman naked. And he talks about how fundamentally innocent and pure it was, and it took me back, because if you read something that's extremely honest, which is Elliot Rodgers' notebook, you can't deny that there is oddly a very odd sense of beauty and shame, and dare I say tragedy to this man, to this deity, right? And he fundamentally destroyed himself. But in destroying himself, he's created something of a spectral aura of himself. We will never know the Elliot Rodger that his father knew or his brother knew, but we know the Elliot Rodger of the book and the meme of him. And I've noticed recently when you posted a retcon, a George Lucas esque retcon of the fight scene, where Anna literally fights Elliot Roger. Would you what makes you want to do that?
Well, that's look. Roger is there's so much that you could unpack there, right? And he does remain this. Uh, Obviously, this was an inflection point in the culture for a multitude of reasons, right? Obviously, it was a negative inflection point as well. But to categorically condemn on any like I'm an overly paranoid person, but it's just what he did was horrible. Obviously, it was incredibly horrible. And at the same time, when you look at this document that he leaves behind and you really analyze it very closely, and I did read it very closely as part of the process of writing this novel, what you realize is that this is not really primarily a manifesto.
Not at all.
Yeah, it's like the last little segment is kind of a manifesto. It's a manifesto perhaps, and then the first 90% essentially is a kind of autobiography, in effect, of somebody who is not neurotypical, right? And I've been thinking about writing a much longer piece about my analysis of Roger, and I haven't really had the energy to do it because so much of that kind of already went into the novel itself, and I'm kind of sort of a bit exhausted with the topic of Inzeldom writ large. But I think when you look at this document, it really is a kind of psychological autopsy, in my view, right? And you really have the feeling that he actually is being honest with himself, and there's not a lot of impression management that's going on. And usually, I think if somebody's really sophisticated, they can weave in impression management into a diary in a way that's calculated. I don't think Roger was sufficiently socially sophisticated to kind of do that.
Yeah, he just simply did not have the IQ to do that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, if he was able to do that, he wouldn't have been as as neurotypical as he was. Sorry, as atypical as he was. And when I look at Roger, there's so many different things that you can analyze here. I think the first thing that I would say is aside from his obvious social deficits. So my recollection is I remember reading about him. So he didn't have, I think, a classic diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder or high functioning autism spectrum disorder. I believe, I think the term is uh, PDD-NOS, pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified. So basically, my understanding is that he had characteristics of being on the spectrum, but it wasn't a clean sort of diagnostic hit in that regard. And actually, when I read through this document slash diary, the thing that really stands out to me is this incredibly intense and shrill narcissism. And I read some psychologist wrote a paper about this, and I read it. It wasn't a particularly thorough analysis. I didn't think it was that great, but I think there's this theme that's really under discussed here, which is that there really is just an astonishing degree of narcissism in the document itself. And it really, really does just stand out to me. And to an extent, I think I kind of wonder, you know, anytime you have a kind of quote unquote lone wolf sort of type psychology emerge out of a population, right? Really, the way that I think about it is it's just sort of a perfect storm, a kind of a psychological alignment of a bunch of compounding internal crises, right? And I think a lot gets attributed to him being on the spectrum. And obviously, the vast majority of the people on the spectrum don't go on to commit mass murder or whatever, right? Slash terrorism, or slash politically motivated terrorism in particular. Uh, but I think I feel like the thrust of everything that happens with him actually is this incredibly intense narcissism. And one of the most interesting things about reading the document, particularly as an Asian man, is seeing that the way that Roger analyzes race in America. And if I can use a metaphor here, he's sort of like a very kind of surface level social radar. So basically, he cannot view anything other than the most obvious superficial social signaling, and he hyperfixates on that. And the way that he hyperfixates on this is he constructs in his mind a hierarchy map of how race works in America, and it's done in this incredibly sort of autistic way. But it's also very interesting because at the same time it's so reductionistic. One perhaps could argue that he's pulling the signal out of the noise, as it were. And in a recent piece that I put out, I talked about how one of the things that's really under discussed is both by Roger and by the media is how much he hates being Asian. Like the fact that he hates being Asian comes up a couple times, and he does discuss it. What's interesting is that it doesn't feel like it's an emotional motivator for him. But then when you look at how he actually carried out this massacre slash terrorist attack, the first thing that he actually does is he stabs his Asian male roommates to death. And for me, I view that as a very, um, a very sad and tragic and also horrific act of internalized racial self-hatred, right? And to finally come around to answering your question, sorry, I'm very circuitous in the way that I talk. This is perhaps about how in mind, but
No, pop off. This is a
it's
feast
also
for
about
me,
how,
dude. I'm
yeah,
enjoying every bit
okay,
of this.
okay, great. Uh, so, uh, yeah, what I did was I released a very lightly modified version of the fight scene from the novel, which takes place midway in the novel. It's a sort of incredibly violent adolescent fight that Anon has. And uh, in the initial draft of in the initial version of the novel, the bully that basically horrifically assaults him and is sort of um, hinted at potentially violently sexually assaulting him by sodomizing him with an object. Delayed spoiler alert. And it's sort of ambiguous as to whether or not that happens, right?
Mm-hmm.
The In the original draft of the book, the bully's name is sort of Aaron, but I have a single descriptor in there that the bully is actually half Asian, right?
Right.
And I realized that this was like insufficiently obvious to people, and that it was just a little detail that wasn't adequately clear. And I just updated in the latest manuscript. I changed the name of this bully, and I also actually cut out the afterword as you guys suggested as well. I have some more thoughts about that later, about the over securitization of the insult. But the reason I did that change in the novel and also in the short story that I released to the public was that I think what I wanted to do was to represent this traumatic physical and potentially sexual assault as a kind of splitting event in the psyche of the protagonist. And essentially, it's a metaphor that um, allows for a secondary, non-literal reading of the character of Anon. And there's just okay, let me continue to explain here because there's a couple of layers here. The canonical reading of this book is in literal terms. So it's not written in a way like American Psycho, where it's not clear if you know Patrick Bateman actually did kill all those people. Like here, the events of the novel are clear. Right? The only thing that's essentially canonically ambiguous is whether or not he was actually sexually assaulted or whether or not he dissociated during that traumatic assault.
Right.
Uh, but the latent reading here is a reading of Anon as a Hopper, much in the same way that Elliot Rodger was a Hopper. And what I mean by this essentially is that there's a kind of uh, mildly implicit interpretation of Jason as a kind of split personality. And in the original drafting of this book, I considered having a reveal at the end similar to Fight Club, where it's quote unquote revealed that Anon and Jason are in fact the same person. And what's happened actually is this very intense racial dissociation that he's been plagued with throughout his life, which explains his particularized hatred of Asian Americans. That's juxtaposed to his admiration for his Korean American friend, who's traditionally masculine. And the reason I didn't do that is I just felt like it would be a retread of Fight Club and it was too on the nose. And instead, what I did was I left this little detail in as a kind of fulcrum point in the middle of the story to kind of hint at that being a latent reading. And something that's very interesting is there's a reviewer on Substack who picked up on this by the name of neoliberal feudalism. And he said that he read the character as being Papa or even Chinese, which I thought was quite surprising. But the I think the point being that if you're an Asian male in America, especially of the millennial generation, this is like before there was any real positive media representation in the public consciousness. Like, if you're a male millennial aged millennial Asian, I guess Roger was a millennial, I would think, even though he's obviously deceased now. I think the racial dysphoria of being an imperial subject in the United States, its moment of sort of peak unipolar power, was for a lot of guys very challenging and very difficult. And what's interesting to me about Roger is not that he, so much that he loved being white, but that he really hated being Asian,
Right.
basically. But anyways, I think to abstract that even one more level, right? There's a very interesting symmetry between the experience of the right-wing white American male and just any sort of immigrant male, say for example, like an Asian American male, right, like myself. And I think the symmetry here that I think is very interesting and kind of hilarious is both of them actually complain about being deracinated. Right?
Exactly.
Which to me is like fucking hilarious. That is really funny. Like if you just think about that, it's hilarious, right? Because basically, like you know, if you're saying a European identitarian, as it were, right? I'm trying to use polarizing language, in interviews, right? But I want to describe things as abstractly and as distant as possible. That's on purpose, and I integrate that style into my Substack very consciously.
It's very tasteful.
Yeah, yeah, and obviously, I'm not aligned with that political project for obvious reasons. But let's just call it that for the time being, right? So, if you're a European identitarian male in the West, right, you know, your your chief opponent in some senses is liberalism with a capital L writ large, right? It's this deracinating effect, it's this tumbling effect, right? And everybody goes into the identity blender, right? The irony, of course, is that there's this completely symmetrical experience of being like an immigrant male, whether you're a Muslim or an East Asian or whatever, right? It's you come here and you basically everybody becomes the type of person that's in a Netflix sitcom, right? With
The
like
Netflixification, yeah.
yeah, it's like everybody meets like this appropriate, level of integration. And I think the tremendous irony of like you you probably read like political commentary of this stuff, but when I was growing up, when I was young, I remember when people in America would complain a lot about multiculturalism, because multiculturalism, which was effectively a sort of precursor to wokeism, was seen as this thing that would cause immigrant ghettos to form and to drive a failure of assimilation and integration, right? And so, like a lot of boomer con conservatives, they'd be like, "Oh, why do we have multiculturalism? We should have a post-national, post-racial identity. Everybody should be American, etc., etc." And what's incredibly funny and just so hilarious is that multiculturalism sort of evolved into secular progressive morality slash wokeism, and through representational politics and through universal progressive morality, it ended up blending everybody into the same identity anyway, right?
Right.
And
You
that's
you are a
yeah,
liberal, no matter where in the system you are a liberal.
exactly 1,000,000%. So if you go to an elite literary party, right, it's going to look diverse, right? So if I had been like some normal Asian American safe trad pub novelist or whatever, right? And I had been like one of these guys who writes a pretty boring book that's not really interesting, doesn't have any edge to it, doesn't really say much, doesn't really have a lot of kind of kinetic energy to it, right? If I was one of these guys and I was at one of the right literary parties, what would we see? We'd see a demographic palette that is reflects the globe-spanning ambitions and scale of the global American empire, right? And we are all now effectively subjects of Rome. We've all been blended, right? And
You
I would
invade the
have
world, you invite the world, basically.
exactly, yeah, yeah, and that sailor aphorism is pretty hard to argue with, right? Just in historical terms, right? And I would have more in common with these other PMCs than I would with many, say, working class, recent Asian immigrants. Maybe there's a language barrier, or even like Silicon Valley, Asian tech bro or whatever, who I might maybe be more ethnically similar to. There's actually more cultural distance between me and that guy and say like somebody in New York who knows what's going on in the lit scene or whatever, right? And so on and so on. So it's all it's all very interesting. Is what I have to say. I think everything is fucking interesting. That's my opinion.
You have unlimited ammunition for a Substack, and I really, really do like that answer. That's this idea of self-Asian hate, because you're right, because Elliot Rodger deeply despised his Asianness, except, I mean, he did like his grandmother. He did have warm memories with his Asian grandmother. But for other than that, he was completely Americanized. And what these boomers don't understand about integration is that the first race to suffer from integration was Europeans. I mean, there was a very interesting book by a very controversial figure in the 1920s called Lothrop Stoddard, and he wrote this book called Reforging of America, 1922. And this was during when a lot of Poles, a lot of, dare I say, Yugoslavians to horror my people were started coming into America. And Lothrop was a foundation, Anglo-American, and he was basically arguing that he's complaining about Polish people. Like, he's this Polish immigrant coming into using our language, using our education system, now wants to advocate for English to not only be a cultural artifact, because from his standpoint, 1920s, English was actually a cultural artifact. He didn't want English to become what it is today, which is just merely the language of commerce at this point. And it's very interesting to see that world point. It's totally contradictory to the boomer out point of, you don't understand that when you say, we must integrate, integration implies a deracination from something else. And you're thinking you're integrating to something that's more of you, which is like, say, like from the European standpoint, you're integrating to some sense of Europeanness. But what you're really doing is that the very vanguard of the political group that came up with that, get infused it with liberalism. And it's like a separation between water and oil. the liberalism eventually rises to the top, and whatever ethnic identity you had is shoved down to the bottom. So number one, the integration affected us first and deracinated us first, and so I have no complaints at all about immigrants who form these ghettos, who don't want to integrate. I mean, look what happened to the people who did integrate first. Like Europeans, like we have the concept of racial identity for many people. I remember having a conversation about this with a man. It was during the BLM riots. And he says, "Oh, those damn blacks, no." And so he even said that. So I was like trying to bridge the idea of like, oh, we're Europeans, we come from this place, we have a shared culture. And he looked at me like I was from outer space, because I was just getting into politics at that time, and the culture idea of, come back into your European roots, this culture, this heritage, this idea. And he was creeped out not by me going like full HBD, about black people, like what Jason would do in Incel. No. It was us talking as white men, but that the fact that I brought up that we're white men, and it made him deeply uncomfortable. It's a very interesting experience. So this idea of deracinization happens at the source, not for other people. It starts up at the very source of the idea even of integration. The idea of integration has deracination built into it, number one. And number two, this idea of Asian self-loathing and being an Asian male, especially, and when you've talked about that, it brought me up some very interesting ideas, because this idea of Asian malehood, if you notice, the Asian male is popping up a lot more. I mean, look at South Korea, right? The gender split. Because when I read your pieces, I read your piece about it, these topics, and I read Chris's piece of Asian American Psycho and so forth, and the idea of like how unfair the sexual market is to Asian men, and it breathes down their necks. Basically, it is an unfounding reality that they must confront every day. And this topic of you're more close to your PMC, this lit literati, than you are with the working class Korean shop owner. I see this phenomenon. I wanted to get your opinion on this, because I was thinking of this before I wanted to interview you. Is I think the bifurcation of the sexes of Asian Americans is going to get a lot stronger in this regard. Because who do you think, who is the forefront? Who wrote Crazy Rich Asians? Who wrote Yellowface? Who wrote all of these I'm an Asian American POC stuff? It's Asian American women. Like they're the forefront of what I call Boba-Tea nationalism, right? They hold on to this idea of being a POC, but they don't want to do any of the work with the confrontation of their own ethnicity. Because to give you a good example, this is a very kind of funny example. I was watching a children's film, and don't worry, I was with underage people, completely normal. And I was watching this film called Turning Red. It's a Pixar film, and it's from an Asian American woman in Canada, and it's a fictionalization of her life. And it's a Pixar film about an Asian Chinese girl from Chinese American parents, and she gets superpowers from her Asian American ancestors. It's typical kind of Oriental magic kind of thing, and she wants to go watch boy bands. She wants to participate in the modern Americana culture. But of course, her tiger mom is very strict, very Mandarin, very the classic Confucian thing. And the conflict of a lot of these products made by Asian American women, keyword being women here, is that the conflict is I want to behave as a liberal, as a American woman. I want to participate in boy bands. I want to do X, Y, and Z. But they have this horror of realization if they go too far in criticizing their strict family culture, if they go too far in criticizing where it came from, they have the shock and horror, like, oh shit, like I might end up being a white girl. So always the resolution of this plot line, as it was in this film, is that the daughter and mother recounsel. The daughter gets to tear up the Confucian social contract, while also blackmailing her family. Not only her family, her ancestor spirits. Basically, give her, oh, I'm so proud of you. Oh, you're such a, you're so noble to the family. Well, in reality, she gets to have her cake and eat it too. At the end of any, you talked about this. You can't critique the GAE as a POC or as an Asian American from the standpoint of liberalism, because the end point of that criticism is that you're not liberal enough. So you have this weird case of you want to feel ethnic, you want to feel tied, but you want to basically break it and force it into the mold that you grew up in. You know what I mean?
Oh man, there is so much. Goddamn, we're gonna go like 6 hours today.
I'm sorry, I wanted to get you a workout.
I'm not complaining because you're actually going to give me a bit of hype here, Look, I have to say I'm a little surprised that you have given it this much contemplation. I think this is ground that is part of like a well-tread civil war between the sexes in Asian America, and particularly I think in the cultural sphere. And the class component is often underemphasized, and it's often like a very important component. Um, Goddamn, there's so many things I could say there. First of all, I would say the I think the guy who has the best takes on this in general, based on what I've read online, is Chris Lee. He has a lot of really interesting things to say about this. Um, first and foremost, the thing you have to understand really just is that I don't think there's like I am just not really convinced that anything Asian like culturally deeply Asian really survives contact with liberalism in America. I'm not convinced that anything really truly survives. Like I think it's just like I think people come here and then like whatever cultural program like existed before, it's like a fucking like complete reboot in a single generation. It's like fucking instant, right? I didn't see it turning red, but I remember seeing about I read some add-on who did a review on it, and I think it broadly sort of aligned with your take as well, right? Which is that there's first of all, the first observation is that most uh, Asian American art is generally made, I think, by Asian American women. I think that's true in literature. I believe it's also true in film, and and then of course also by gay Asian American men. So those two groups are much more represented in cultural production relative to straight Asian men in these very kind of upper echelon spheres of cultural production. And I mean, you could create all sorts of theories as to why that is the case. I mean, more broadly, right? If you look at a guy like Alex Perez, Alex Perez has noted that it doesn't really matter what skin color, diaspora, POC type straight male you are, you're gonna have a hard time getting into the literary sphere, right? Into like upper echelon, high status literary fiction publishing and so forth. It's gonna be really hard to get your book through. Is part of that due to this broader pattern of institutional sort of capture by like effectively liberal white women in publishing? Maybe, yes. And so then does that kind of extend out into POC spheres as well? Yes. Does that extend into the Asian sphere as well? Yes. There is absolutely a massive asymmetry between the experience of being an Asian American woman versus the experience of being an Asian American male. And obviously, a lot of people are very, very interested in dating or having sex with Asian American women. And certainly for the millennial generation, the amount of sort of interpersonal racism that you encounter as a male in dating was, at least in my experience, fairly high. I'm a bit older. I know at least for guys of my generation, a lot of a pattern that I would notice was that a lot of them would deliberately date outside of their race, almost as a kind of self-esteem building mechanism to sort of prove to themselves that they were sexually viable. And I think to a degree, there was often a kind of degree of perhaps a degree of kind of trying hard and sort of overcompensation. And I think in retrospect is very understandable because the funniest thing ever is the thing that really saved Asian American men, I think, in American culture, was literally K-pop.
I was about to say fucking K-pop, yeah.
like, 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 yeah, you can make all these, like, K-pop as an industry is this, like, horribly exploitative, like, hyper-capitalist, like, human soul grinder, or whatever, right? But boy, has it made it easier being, like, being a young Asian American man. I'm too old to really have, like, capitalized on that shit. But I certainly noticed when that happened with a great deal of astonishment. Because Andrew, like, attractive androgynous maledom was not really a thing for the millennial generation in general, right? This was, I think, a period of, like, peak hypermasculinity, saying hip hop, rap, all the stuff we cringe at now.
Yeah, Tucker Max.
Yeah. So, look, a ton of ink has been spilled about what it's like to be an Asian American woman versus what it's like to be an Asian American man. I wouldn't say I have a super novel take here, apart from observations about how it plays out in elite spheres of cultural production. And if I were to go particularly into the literary sphere, right, how many straight Asian male novelists, can the average person name, right? Apart from Haruki Murakami, who obviously is not going to be viewed as like a sexually viable entity in the way that, just like a younger guy would be. Right?
And let's be honest, he's a literary version of K-pop. He's a deeply, deeply westernized figure.
Yeah, and like, I mean, he's kind of a meme at this point, too. Not to denigrate his accomplishments. I mean, I read one or two of his books, which I liked a lot, but I know, from what I understand, he's sort of repeating himself at this point, which is okay, I guess, if you write 15 books or whatever. But, like, if you are in these really elite literary institutional spaces, I think the extent to which it's difficult to be a androgenic straight male novelist as an Asian man is like that's like a difficulties that's a 10 out of 10 difficulty setting, right? I think basically the guy that we would point to would be Tao Lin, because I think Tony Tamuti, I think he's a fantastic writer. I don't think he's got as much cultural awareness as Tao Lin. But even what's interesting about Tao Lin is that Tao Lin very much underemphasizes his race, right? And like if you look at his initial breakout phase, he was not at all leaning into like identity politics of like, oh, I'm like an Asian man, getting pussy or whatever, right? Like that's not what his books were about. That's not what his fiction was about. It was basically he was like, I'm a hipster. It was like cultural hipsterdom, as I understand it.
Right.
I'm speaking out of my ass partly because I haven't read any of his books except the latest one. But I think just more broadly, when an elite cultural space hits a certain gendered tipping point, I think my hypothesis is that gender becomes culturally hegemonic. So I think that, generally speaking, happened when sort of, and I just want to be clear, I've got no hate for white women. I know plenty of white women. They're very nice people. Many of them are my friends, right?
Listen, you have a white friend here. I'm giving you the pass. I'm giving you the pass. All right.
Yeah, I don't hate, white people or white women. But anyways, I think this is just a natural kind of. I don't think this was like a conspiracy at all. I think there's just a kind of natural and incremental trajectory that occurred in the in elite institutional publishing, again, at the upper echelon, the literary fiction echelon. We're not talking about genre here. We're talking about sort of, where the mimetic and moral authority accumulates, as it were, right? At some point, there was an inflection point where that tipped into a zone where white females were the majority, and then their preference, and then a majoritarian sort of rule plays out, and then that becomes the prevailing aesthetic filter, and their cultural tastes become the prevailing cultural filter, and it's aesthetic and political, etc., etc., etc. That has been mirrored with Asian Americans, particularly in publishing, in my view. And I honestly don't think it would be possible to write an aggressively androgenic or heterosexual male literary fiction book about being a contemporary young Asian man in America today who's like interested in getting laid, as it were.
Listen,
Right?
it'll be
Now,
totally impossible. It's intrinsically
yeah,
it's on the nerve, like I said.
yeah, because, and the reason is, I think, because that would have to pass through, say, like the intern slush pile. And who's the intern going to be? Well, if you look at the demographics, it's from what I can tell, it's a mixture of like POC women and white women, right? Plus or minus, um, I think POC gay men and white men. Right? Those are, I think, the predominant cultural. Um, that's where the energy is, essentially, right?
That's where the filters are.
Yeah, yeah. And look, I write about the reason I write about this on a systems level is because I don't want to be the guy who's bitching and complaining about it or angry about it. Because I think that's just like a low agency way of like looking at the world. And I don't even like I want to be clear in that like I don't view these people as like, like my quote unquote enemies that I'm like waging war on, as it
Right.
were, right? Because I don't like what's playing out here is just the natural and like evolution and emergent dynamics of cultural evolution in general. This isn't like this isn't like 2006 Iraq where like like one side's like kidnapping everybody and like putting power girls into their knees and stuff, right? Like the stakes are not that high, right? And one might argue that this is a kind of overcorrection to publishing being, male dominated up until recently, right? And so, do we really get to complain on, like, if we take the long historical view, right? I mean, were women writing novels 100 years ago to the extent that they are now? Obviously not. So, I'm not really like, I'm not like salty about it, but I think it's fucking interesting, which is why I write about it. It's all just very, very interesting,
It is.
but
It is pretty
yeah.
interesting. No, I 100% agree. It is, and you know what? Oddly enough, when we talk about when the gender dynamics or when the gender ratios get to abnormally, overwhelmingly, because like you see as with universities, they become more conformist, more kind of factional. The higher the amount of women come into the space, and I'm sorry to say, but Chateau Hartiche used to talk about this on his blog. His last piece was actually on this, if I recall correctly. And say what you will about Hartice, but you have to admit, during that era of the manosphere, like ideology is kind of like fashion; it can only go downward. Like you gotta admit, Hartice is fucking Einstein compared to Andrew Tate. You know what I mean? He clearly has some capable intelligence compared to like the kind of weird ghettoized manosphere we have today. And he did talk about that at the time. And the reason why I brought it up to you is because I just find it from outside POV. I see this aspects of Asian masculinity because you brought up like K-pop. As an Asian man, you have these two winding paths. You have Elliot Rodger, and you have fucking K-pop. These are your two. Yeah, which way Oriental man? It's basically it. And the thing is, the fact that your acceptable expression of sexuality is is this very safe sexuality of K-pop, and I saw this with white men emerge with this idea of I forgot who made up the term. Are you familiar with the term "safe horny"? It's like a safe, very like as a man, you can say, "Oh, I really like girls. Tall girls. Like, there's nothing very descriptive. I just really like girls. If they don't want to have sex with me, that's okay. But man, I really like to." This idea of safe horniness, a very like kind of, it's completely defanged. This intrinsic concept of sexuality is defanged, and you see this with these K-pop kids, and you see them, and they're just pure products. I have no idea how you could sexualize them, to be honest with you. There's the aesthetic, there's kind of a little bit of Apollonian kind of beauty, the paleness, the kind of nice jawline, but they're kind of like mannequins. Like, there's nothing sexual. I mean, even Mishima's hairy ass was more sexual, to be honest with you, as a straight guy, than this. I had this idea of the TMC class, their version of sexuality. Okay, we need to give Asians some sexuality, like the Netflixication of sexuality is you get the K-pop stans, you get this, and as an Asian male, I can you know imagine that this is my two options. Really, it's either Rogers or this weird, deeply plastic and fake and just weird, bizarre, purely performative. It's frankly absurd.
Man, okay, look, there's so many threads again. This is a very generative conversation. So the first thing I would say is, yeah, the K-pop thing is just interesting on so many different levels. I think it's not that historically novel, just because if we look at earlier generations of American musicians, we did have this like generation that was very androgynous, right? So like
Boy
Bowie,
bands.
obviously, yeah. Boy bands were like, so obviously they copied from boy bands, but there were also more serious musicians who were also sort of androgynous. I agree. Obviously, you and I look at that and relate. I mean, like, look, I remember being young and seeing K-pop like videos online, and I remember explicitly thinking to myself, this will literally never cross over to America. This is literally impossible. It's literally impossible that teenage girls will find this appealing, right? Because this was like, I think I was like looking at like 50 Cent and Eminem as like points of comparisons. And at this point, like male boy bands had died in America too. But they were able to do it. And there's a lot of, I think the way that they construct these groups is, I think, I don't know a whole lot about it, but it is very, very sophisticated. And the way that they shoot the music videos is like incredibly sophisticated stuff. But I think this idea of there not being a clear masculinity template for the Asian male in particular is very true, right? There actually is a third path, but it's more, I think, like SoCal regional slash New York. It's kind of like the Asian hype beast guy, right? This was like not real. Like in my generation, there were like Asian there's like Asian EDM culture, so like quote unquote being a raver. But if I were to bring this back to the broader theme of what we're talking about, it's the identity shredder, basically, right? Is the Asian male comes to America from Asia, right? He's deracinated, so like the cultural programming is his self-conception is deleted. I think Chris has, I can't remember where I read this, but one of his mental models is like a lot of these guys just think of themselves as quote unquote defective white males or perceived as such. And all he can do is sort of latch on to some other external artifice because he doesn't have a conception of himself. And one thing you'll see a particular type of Asian guy do is he'll really lean very, very heavily into like African American culture, right? In a way that comes off as like deeply inauthentic and exaggerated.
Rice gum, basically.
And yeah, and like and in a way that's in a way that's like frankly sort of embarrassing. Sometimes it's authentic because sometimes these guys really do like grow up in these areas, and they really are actually functionally fully integrated into like African American culture. But yeah, like I don't know if that answers your question more fully. I think over time, I don't know what you see in your generation, From what I can tell, this younger generation of Asian American men is much better adjusted than the millennials were. But I think I agree. Like historically speaking, you could argue we're more recent immigrants, so this process of integration is taking much longer. But the variable that perhaps most interests me, and it's one that we haven't discussed yet, is I think so much of the shame of being an immigrant is actually a function of the place that you came from and its power relationship to the imperial metropole or the imperial core, right? And men of my generation, if you came, China was like a second world country. It wasn't a third world country, but it was like a second world country, right? This post-Deng era, a lot of the time it's sort of like Chinese techno-capital is like powering up, right? And now what interests me is when I look at how, say, this more modern generation relates to Americans when they come through, they do seem a lot more confident simply because the power relation has diminished substantially, right? And of course, if we were to bring this back to Nickel Land, I mean, I don't actually remember where he wrote this or even know, but he was fairly prescient. I think was it 2015 when he said Neo China Rise from the Future or something?
No, this was the 90s. He wrote this in the 90s Meltdown. This was back when he was still a leftist. Yeah, he wrote that. That's when he moved to China, was actually in the 90s, when he moved to Shanghai.
Yeah, okay. So that's like really, really impressive that he was able to extrapolate that curve, right? Because up until about like fucking 2 years ago, the consensus among the US like national security establishment was essentially that like like Chinese people cannot like innovate on engineering or something. They can only copy or something effectively. And now basically like all the hawks are freaking the fuck out because they're like, oh shit, they can like like I read a stat. There's this guy on Twitter. He's like a VC, venture capitalist. And so apparently the PRC has 6 million STEM grads a year, right, coming from like top tier, and like many of them are from like the equivalent of like top tier universities. Like the fact that Land was able to see that curve that far out is very impressive. When I, as an Asian person, it didn't even occur to me that that would be fucking possible. I'm Chinese, like I'm literally Chinese, right?
True. Well, he went native. He literally did move and learn to speak the language and actually lived there and is allowed to say these things.
Yeah, I would kill to meet that guy. But yeah, I mean, if you, I've only plugged into this more lately, but just the pace of techno capital, the acceleration of techno capital in the PRC right now is completely bonkers. It's insane. We're only just beginning to see this sort of protectionist response function to that. And one as like American multinationals panic about markets being cannibalized, like for example, EVs and whatnot. What interests me is how will this affect Asian American art and literature, right? Because like I think the old like sort of Anglo-imperial take was that the Chinese would never reach parity with the West ever, sort of thing, right? Like they were sort of genetically incapable of doing this.
They were just America's factory, basically.
Exactly, and not even like the high-tech factory, but like a low-end factory, right? And then of course, like the in distinction to that is the Landian take of, well, maybe this is actually this very old and advanced civilization that had this like long interregnum period of just constantly fucking up and like having infighting, and now it's this giant thing that's like rebooting, right? And that interests me, and I think I haven't yet started working on my next book because I'm frankly like it took so much energy to put that first novel out. It was like such like a sort of artistic systems novel that it was like it took a lot of work. But I think in my next book, I intend to lean very heavily into a much closer reading of Land given that his initial predictions were validated, vis-a-vis the sort of East-West relation, but also vis-a-vis machine intelligence more broadly. But that's going to take a long ass time to write. I'm looking forward to it, but I just haven't powered up to getting there yet.
All right. Okay, so you brought up some interesting points about the idea of China rising, that the inflection, the view of China, of the imperial center of America, is kind of inflective with also how the Chinese American, the Chinese youth of Americans during the millennial era see China. Because you see, China has two epochs. It has the complete identity shredding under Mao, who just completely just erased it in any sense of what China was before. And then you had the king of the ashes turning it into a giant factory, to a factory pile, is Deng Xiaoping during the mid 70s all the way to the 90s. And so you could see this kind of reflective within not only China in relation to the imperial center, but also China's diaspora. I can't say the word for life of me. Diaspora of the Chinese immigrants looking back into China. Correct?
Yeah. So the framing that I would basically use here is just a very kind of simple identity relation. So if we model the modern United States as a vast, multi-ethnic, globe-spanning empire, and then if we zoom in to the literati who are producing high culture in the form of, dense, stylistic prose fiction novels. And if we zoom in even further onto the various immigrant diaspora writers of that generation, I think one of the key variables that determines the character of the work that these people produce as citizens of the imperial core, as it were, is the relative power relation from their country or nation of origin and the American hegemon. And so if we look at Asian American novelists in particular of an earlier generation, perhaps even prior to millennials, say somebody like Amy Tan and Joy Luck-Club, whatever the fuck book nonsense. There's a deep sense of shame there, right? And the shame, in my view, is primarily downstream from historical and geopolitical events and relative national power itself, right? Because one way to view Deng Xiaoping and then the trajectory of the PRC following him is as sort of these leaders dragging China into modernity and late industrial capitalism and very gradually pressing the buttons on the computer and rebooting this enormous industrial machine of techno-capital and computation and so forth and industrial manufacturing, etc. And if you look at these novelists from this earlier era up to and perhaps including my era, where the relative power relation between the home country and the United States was such that China was seen as weak and backward and so forth. I think a lot of the self-hatred and lack of confidence in the writing and the art and in identity is merely just downstream from raw geopolitical and national power. And now, if you look at, as a point of comparison, modern Korean American literary fiction writers or filmmakers, for example, I don't remember the name of the guy who made Beef, but again, Beef is a great show on Netflix. If you want to see something made by an Asian American, it's actually good.
Yeah, it's the guy from Walking Dead, right? I think I recognized him.
Yeah, so he's the main character, Stephen Ewan. I'm talking about the guy who wrote and directed the Netflix series. I just don't
Oh yeah, no,
remember
I was
his
saying the
name.
actor in there. I think I remember him
Oh
from.
yeah. And Stephen Ewan is really coming to his own as an actor. Like I think he's a great actor. So I think my theory is that part of the cultural confidence of the Korean American now relative to say the Chinese American artist of an earlier generation is literally just a function of the fact that Korea now is like kind of hyper modern, you know, it's at the leading edge of techno-capital, and that there's a whole bunch of like semiconductor fabs there and stuff, right? They do the hardest of the hard kind of engineering when it comes to computer hardware. And they also have a large defense industry, as it so happens, but they also have a conception of themselves as being confident and self-assured. And this is not to lean in to Edward Said style Orientalist analyses, because I am slightly embarrassed to say I haven't actually read that book.
Half the people who use the word Orientalism have not read that book.
Yeah. Although I think we all kind of know what it is, right? And even Asian American immigrants like myself who are disconnected from their home countries will often adopt kind of reductive Orientalist framing. I was certainly guilty of that when I was younger. But the point just being that if it is the case that this giant techno-capital accelerator is now booting up in the East in the Landian sense, if Neo-China truly is arriving from the future, this will bring East and West to a point of parity that basically has not existed for hundreds of years. And that will have very interesting downstream implications for high culture in the form of literary fiction and filmmaking, in my view. And I think it will just be quite interesting to see the type of art that is produced when the relative power gaps, military, economic, and finally cultural, become closed. And perhaps that's already happened on two of those three fronts, some might argue. And for myself, I think one thing that I do remain interested about is the conflict and competition between East and West in the geopolitical sphere, but also I think in the cultural sphere. And I think change is always a very generative thing. So whereas millennials and older lived in the eternal, you know, unipolar era, the seemingly eternal unipolar era, the Fukuyama moment, as it were, right? We couldn't conceive of an identity outside of liberalism. I do wonder, with great interest, you know, what kind of stuff are we actually going to produce now as Asian American writers when the world changes in the way that it's very clearly changing now? And it's a moment of great anticipation and probably great turmoil if the national security establishment has its way, unfortunately. But hopefully, nothing cataclysmic will happen. I'm optimistic on that front. But the main thing is that I love art, I love reading, I love stories, I love narrative. And I think as much as liberalism is this very kind of vague and omnipresent thing that I critique as being constraining for artists, not just white American artists, but artists of all stripes in America. I think the world is always changing, and I just have this incredibly strong intuition that we are in this, which I think many people share, that we are now in an era of great tumult and change. And I think it's going to be tremendously generative for artists of any background whatsoever. And when I wrote my novel, when I wrote Incel, it was in many ways a kind of integration between my observations from the distance about Asian American masculinity, but also about white identity and the contradictions of modern liberalism as a identity shredder for all races. And as I hopefully one day continue on to my next book, I think that I'm optimistic that this will continue to be a very sort of interesting, rich ground. And that's, of course, in addition to all the more generalized metaphysical and philosophical dimensions that, you know, find their way into my fiction and the fiction of other interesting writers, right? And neuroscience, philosophy, artificial intelligence, etc., etc. These are all what I love about the novel as a form, Gabe, is its ability to really put so many different things into a blender because text is so rich. It's such a free form in a way that film and visual media aren't. That it is so liberating when you can switch from close-up narration, action, internal monologue, broad social observation, humor. It's really hard to do that in a strictly visual medium. And text, I think, will still retain great power, even in an era of VR and AR. I do have that optimism as much as I sort of doom pill myself on myself.
Right. Yeah, the interiority of the novel is our strongest defense against the AI, right? Against the AI slop bots,
Yeah,
writing genre fiction.
100%.
And from my understanding, and so with your next novel, to preemptively wrap this up, I would like to say this brings me this idea of both suffering and identity. It sums up beautifully in that scene with Chloe when Anon loses virginity for the first time. And when he says "fuck it," he throws a Viagra into the toilet, and he's experiencing this wonderful scene with this woman. And this woman, he can't get it hard. He doesn't know really how to insert properly. And this woman, in her infinite grace, the great, almost kind of the most empathetic, other than she's kind of a corollary between the woman at the end, this infinite kindness where she says it's okay, and she kind of guides him and like kind of walks him into herself and into them. They briefly become a them, but Anon's still so into himself and still refusing, not even refusing, he's incapable of enjoying it in the moment. He has to holographically project himself into the mirror, right? Because the one thing he lacks as an Anon, as himself, is that he is a vessel, and that he is both experiencing this suffering and experiencing this identity through a lens, which is the mirror in that scene. And and I can see this kind of concept, this idea of suffering. I mean, you mentioned it with your at the ending point with the leaf box, the idea of suffering, even of the atoms. Even the atoms of the universe, and in some sense, have a suffering, and that's just reflective in that psychology scene at the end. So, as a sort of final word on this, for now anyway, that on your next novel, you plan on fusing this idea of identity and suffering, also with the threat of AI, the threat of technology, of techno-capital acceleration, and also kind of search for religiousness, if I recall correctly. You mentioned I forget which part of the Bible, but you also tried to find some kind of a religious meaning as well.
Yeah. I really want to thank you for being so closely reading me and also closely preparing for this interview. I think it's really impressive. I mean, I can tell you put a ton of work into this, and it's a real joy to engage with somebody who is paying attention. Um, yeah, I mean, one thing that I didn't talk about during this interview, just as a prelude to my answer, is that I am incredibly motivated by beauty. And as much as my novel is sort of like a work of sort of black comedy in many ways and a satire, um, I try as much as possible to include these moments of beauty and compassion into this otherwise, majority sort of black pilled, story, and to kind of mutated or transmuted into something that ultimately repudiates nihilism. And part of the deep love that I have for fiction is when I write, I really can feel for all of these characters and what they're experiencing. And it's almost as if I feel as if I'm just channeling events that are taking place on another plane and are emerging, through my fingertips on a keyboard. And that's not to, you know, elevate a kind of mysticism that I don't really believe in. I mean, it really, my point just is that I really do feel as if that's happening. And like any other person, I've been greatly moved by moments of compassion that I have seen, that I have given to others, and that other people have given to me. In terms of my next work, I've not yet started working on it. The framing that I am bringing to it can be sort of summarized in two dimensions. In the first dimension, I would say that I think modern nihilism is downstream of two shocks. The first shock is the sort of Nietzschean death of God and the ascent of Darwinism. The second shock, I think, is atomization driven by a combination of urban capitalism and plus the impact of the sexual revolution. So a sort of kind of Welbeckian kind of take on the sexual revolution. And I think the third wave of nihilism will be driven by, and perhaps the most profound, although we don't know yet, will be driven by the ascent of machine intelligence, of the human being's apex role in nature as being usurped. The way that I'm approaching this essentially is I'm thinking, and I may write a completely different book, but this is what I'm sort of toying with now. It's this idea of a kind of modern retelling of Ecclesiastes, but with the role of God sort of substituted with machine intelligence. And it will necessarily be a sort of very kind of more, I think, more overtly Landian book. Because my anticipation is that this is kind of where things are probably going. But it's a very loose idea, and it's not fully formed in the slightest. And I haven't started at all. So, maybe in 2 or 3 or 5 years, I'll bring you something completely different. But when I have conversations like this with people like you, it energizes me tremendously to keep going. Because the main thing that gets in the way of writing for me is just waging.
Yeah, the wage cage, exactly.
It's like I like most of the stuff that I do, but of course, fiction is my first love and always will be. But I'm not unique in the experience of not being able to pay food or rent with book sales, and that's okay. But it does present certain practical limits on how much time I can pour into things in any one year.
Well, you just gotta wait for the next crypto pump and dump. You gotta invest in the right shit all the time, right?
That's right. That's right.
Well, I think that is an immensely fertile thoughtscape that an artist of your caliber will be able to plow effortlessly. By the way, it's becoming this wonderful event has been drawing to a near. Sadly, hopefully for drawing near only for more fruitful conversations in the future. Han, thank you for tonight. I truly appreciate your time and allowing me to theory sell at you for 2 hours straight. I mean, my co-hosts need a drink in order to bear with my theory selling half the time. So Han, thank you very much for this. Where can the good people find you? And out of all your Substack pieces, as a final note, what do you think is the best starter pack Substack essay from Mr. ARX-HAN?
Thank you, thank you. So if folks want to find me, I'd say go to my Substack. That's where I post my long form writing, www.decentralizedfiction.com. And I'd say my favorite piece probably still remains my first piece, which is an analysis of modern literary culture, which is literary culture is purely culture. A sort of theoretical overview of where I analogize between sort of Christian purity culture and secular purity culture. And lastly, I would, of course, encourage people to check out my novel, Incel, available on Amazon. And as the good boys at Tooky have taken the time to review. And thank you very much for, I think, what was an absolutely fantastic discussion. And I'm sure we'll have the opportunity to connect again.
Perfect. Thank you, Mr. Han. All right, everyone. Good night and good tugging.